Welcome, everyone. I'm Bonnie Stacy. I'm the Chief Curator of the Martha's Vineyard Museum, and we are really pleased to share this program with you today. But before we get started, I want to acknowledge and pay due respect to the Wampanoag people on whose ancestral land, here known as Nabnocket, the museum now stands. We recognize their millennia of stewardship, their continued presence in, and their contributions to our island and community. Valerie Craigwell White, great-great-granddaughter of Reverend William Jackson, grew up with vivid oral family stories told about him and his wife, Jane. Valerie's fascination deepened when her sister gave her photocopies of Jane's letters, which began to fill in important texture about the Jacksons' lives, leading to years of intermittent research. I am particularly grateful to Valerie for her help throughout the process of researching and writing this exhibition. In fact, it was the phone call from her that gave me the idea to do it in the first place. The more I thought about it, the more I thought, this guy has a great story. Valerie's currently working on a book about Reverend Jackson. She's joining us from Oregon to share some stories about him. Welcome, Valerie.
Thank you. It's terrific to be here. And as we get started, Bonnie, I would also like to add a little bit more on the land acknowledgement, because I'm on land in Oregon and the Jacksons came from Virginia. So I'd like to honor and acknowledge the people who were first in Oregon, where I am now, and Virginia, earliest home to the Jacksons. Calapooya, Multnomah, Clackamas, Powhatan, Mattaponi, Pamunkey, and Accomack. We consider in gratitude both the historic legacy of these people and their responsible custodianship of the land and your continued presence today. So one of the things that's going to happen is that Savannah at the museum is going to help me out so that I don't have to worry about the technical pieces of advancing slides. So Savannah, I really want to say thank you for that, and acknowledge that the rest of you are going to have to hear me say, okay, which will mean next slide, please. But let's get started. Reverend William Jackson and Jane Adora Major Jackson were born at the edge of the sea, in my mind, strongly tied to it from their earliest lives in Virginia, and later as their years spanned the 19th century. Not unusual for their era, they stayed near the coast, and I believe it's what drew them to Martha's Vineyard in their later decades. After a life of travel and too much time apart, they wanted roots here. And in buying their cottage on Central Avenue in 1871, they assured it became inextricably linked to them and their generations of kin. Despite our years away, no matter how far we sail, Oak Bluffs is still our local. The 1797 watercolor of Norfolk pilot vessels, Black pilots, and crew reminds me of what anchored them and me. As I said, it's so good to be here. And Bonnie, you led the team that envisioned and created the beautiful and first exhibit anywhere about the Jacksons. On behalf of them and their descendants, their beloved New Bedford community members and their descendants, thank you from the bottom of our hearts for the honor you've brought. For Reverend and Jane Jackson's 7th generation grandchildren, Aaliyah, Arden, Everett, Vivian, who are here listening, they'd love that you are here. It takes a village to run a remote slideshow. I just need to say that for each of you who's here, for whatever drew you to this presentation today, you're in my village now too. I love my village. Important for their contributions in their own right, the Jacksons also represent the countless other Black abolitionists who courageously risked everything in full sight during the day and crept through perilous shadows in the darkest of nights. Our grand US American experiment continues today, but as William, Jane, and their children showed, there have long been brave souls who took the hands of the vulnerable, sometimes elbowing their way forward, on behalf of others. Anti-slavery work, uplifting the religious and spiritual lives of others while holding on to their own faith that faced strenuous tensions along the way and tests. While nurturing children who are good people, it made for full lives. Surely they knew joy along the way. In fact, there are many stories passed down through the generations about the weekly gatherings the family would have on Sundays around lots of food, laughter, ever-present singing and piano music, violin performances. But today, I'm going to talk more about the challenges through which they persisted and thrived. They made it, and we will too. Who were they, William and Jane? Who were they really? And who were they ultimately? I'll use their voices as much as I can today to tell a few vignettes and stories from their early and middle years before the vineyard came to know them. There's a lot to squish into 40, 45 minutes or so. But as my father used to say, you want folks to leave, you want to leave folks after time together when they're saying, baby, don't go, there's so much more to hear. And I hope that if that's the case for you, you'll find a way to follow up directly with me to hear more stories and talk about the Jacksons and what we might learn from them. Next slide, please. Oh, thanks. The picture that you were just looking at was a picture of shackles that I took when I was at the Whaling Museum a couple of years ago. And I intentionally took that image so that the shadow of my hands showed through the shackles. But in talking about this, thank you. But in talking about for a couple of minutes about enslavement and slavery, I wanted to have the image of the Emancipation oak tree that's in Hampton, Virginia, showing while I talk about it. Though free, the Jacksons were born in the middle of slavery, enslavement, auction blocks, people named Patty, John, Mary, Henry, Keziah, and such, who are known only as slaves by some. Slave patrols, hunters, free Black status registrations and passes, presumed status or suspicion based on one's color, shape of their nose, their hair, coffles, those lines of men, women, and children chained and stumbling together hundreds of miles south, away from what they had known and who they had known. Restrictions, including Black codes, fugitives, now called self-liberated or self-freed, and fugitive slave courts, abolitionists, allies, spontaneous or structured flights to hoped for freedom. Whether you were enslaved, a free Black person, an owner, an overseer, a helper, a bystander. Were there really bystanders? Was there such a thing? The system of slavery in some way, shape, or form influenced nearly everything, and it was no different for the Jacksons. This Emancipation oak, which I got to lay my hand on in May when I was in Virginia, has long been told to be the first place in the South where the newly liberated, excuse me, or self-liberated folks first heard the Emancipation Proclamation read to them in 1863. What better than to have an oak ground us in our conversations today? The formal structure of enslavement would end while its vast, insidious tentacles held on, despite the Emancipation Proclamation and what followed. The Jacksons could be ecstatic and realistic about the road ahead to full freedom. So again, I ask the question, who were they? Next, please. This amazing thing emerged a few months ago, actually, I think maybe a year ago, just about, from my cousin Christina's spare room, we'll call it, and a box she'd probably wondered about for a long time. And in it, lo and behold, was the Cottage City, which was what Oak Grove was called back in the day, had produced a festival flyer. And there it was. And there was Reverend Jackson's image on it. And I'm showing this image at the beginning of the talk today, or near the beginning, because what I'm hoping to provide is that for those of you who may have heard for years, not much more than the fact that he was the town crier in Oak Grove, that there is more to him and to Jane, who was there right along his side. And that's what we'll be exploring. Thank you. Next slide. Reverend Jackson was born in 1818, and he lived until 1900. And here's what he had to say. I was born in Norfolk, Virginia, in the year of our Lord, 1818, on August 16th. My father was the son of the late Henry Jackson and of the same name. They were Norfolk port pilots, and my grandfather and father both owned property. Now me. In a maritime-centered community, to be a licensed pilot was to be at the apex as a Black man then. William's father, Henry Sr., was free, and he'd been a pilot at least from 1791. He was one of 10 free Black property owners in Norfolk, which had about 4,000 folks at the time, and 40 or 45% of them were Black. And the vast majority of them were enslaved. The ones who were enslaved were scattered around town in the homes of folks doing service. And then because it was a maritime town, there were a number of enslaved Black people, mostly men, working on the docks, serving as unloaders, caulkers, all kinds of positions. William's father was enslaved until he was freed in 1811 when he was 29. There are at least a couple of other things of note about his father. According to William, he directed American vessels that were evading the British blockades in the War of 1812 and was respected for those efforts. Further, he was a pilot by 1824 because, again, William writes that his father ferried General Lafayette around, the Marquis de Lafayette, around in his triumphal visit when he returned to the United States in 1824. And Henry Jr. was the one who sailed the vessel, the Virginia, Steamboat Virginia, into Yorktown, where the grandest festivities would be held. It's quite a responsibility. The reason I'm taking a minute to tell you about those people is that I think being in the orbit of family members such as them really provided him some of the confidence and self-assurance that served him well in his life that he might not have acquired under other circumstances. We know that his mother, Keziah, was enslaved too, at least for a period, because William's eldest brother was enslaved. And back then, you inherited the status of your mother. And her mother must have been enslaved too, because Keziah was born enslaved. She was free by the time William was born, when she was 50. He says, my mother's mother was an Indian woman who lived to be 110 years old. My mother's father was an Englishman. So who was William? He was a minister, abolitionist, social activist and protester, including physical engagement and protest, Underground Railroad conductor, community leader, such as president of the New Bedford Colored People's Association, a steward on US naval ships, conflict and social action mediator, maybe that's where I got it, public, including secular speaker at important community events. He's in the newspaper a lot when important things happened, particularly in New Bedford, Massachusetts, related to racial and social justice issues. Fundraiser, educator, butler, gardener, father, and husband. He loved music, and it saturates his writing about his times and what he was proud of. And in the last year of his life, he wrote about the importance of love. Next slide, please. He says, I now became acquainted with my wife. She was then a major from Accomack, Virginia, who is much devoted to the Baptists with most of her people. And this, of course, caused me to be very careful in her presence and also to go to church with her. To have the privilege of sitting with the Miss M, I rented pew number 23. I knew about my great-great-grandmother's later years, but I had so many questions about the early ones that shaped her. There's still so much to learn. I can't describe the beauty of Paramore Island, where the US Census says she lived with her family when she was 6 in 1820. I sure felt it when I went looking for her on this Nature Conservancy land in May. She was a young and capable country girl. Next, please. Jane Jackson, 1814 to 1888. She too was an abolitionist, Underground Railroad assistant, church leader and liaison, including when Reverend Jackson's absences caused people to have questions or they wanted to make comments. And this could be sometimes a challenge for her because as a Black Baptist woman back then, the constraints around what she can say and to whom she might say it were such that there was probably a fine line that she had to walk sometimes in giving information. She was a crisis and disturbance manager, community welfare group organizer, a fundraiser. She was a professional seamstress, a musician. She played the piano, taught her children, and they even had a piano in the 1840s, which is just remarkable. She was a wet nurse, a family healer, household and resource manager, animal handler and gardener, family correspondent and liaison, mother and wife, daughter-in-law. I was thinking, in many respects, she reminds me of my mother, who was married to a fighter pilot who was gone a lot. And the joke used to be among the spouses was that when they left on their temporary deployments or longer, you took over and you had to run everything. And then when they came back, you turned over the checkbook, which we don't even have checkbooks anymore, really, and the car keys, and went back to your life of doing the rest of the things that you'd been doing all along. Before I spend more time telling you about their formative years, I want to jump into a couple of stories Reverend Jackson told about his Underground Railroad activities. As some of you have let me know in the last few days, you're really interested in hearing about that. So a couple of hours ago, I decided to move that up earlier in my talk. To be clear, Jane was deeply involved in providing direct support to those freedom seekers who made it to their home. She fed them, she tended their wounds, she listened to their stories, she provided comfort. She certainly was affected by her husband's involvement in what you're about to hear. But these are William's big rescues that I'm going to talk about next. Because I've started using languages like wife and husband, I want to just acknowledge that I understand that those terms are very fluid. Gender identification is fluid, and I'm choosing to use the language that would have resonated for them in their day. Their abolition work is documented first by a letter that actually came from Jane. You'll see it later, a little bit later, the physical copy of it, when I get to where I would have been talking about this. But the letter itself is dated in 1843. And in signing the letter or writing the whole letter, it looks more like it was someone else who wrote it, perhaps her father-in-law. She committed a crime, and later she probably would have been charged for treason. And so to write a letter was a radical act, and it was no small thing. Their activities in the Underground Railroad and abolition continued into the early part of the Civil War as they looked for funds and resources to help self-freed people heading north. You'll also see a couple other letters that I'll reference a little bit when I'm reading you the next couple of stories. The first is probably the one that's the most well in New Bedford, about William Henry Taylor, because he was the fugitive, self-liberated, self-freed parishioner of the Jacksons at their church in West Philadelphia, who in 1850 was snared up when the Fugitive Slave Act passed in September, and he was believed to be the first one scooped up. Rather than read you William's lengthy account, I think I could do a whole week just on dissecting what he had to say about that event. Here's what I'd like to read to you about it. I have some new thinking. When William led the group of agitated men to rescue his parishioner Taylor, it's an understatement to describe it as a bold, spontaneous move during highly dangerous times. As he later wrote, he was driven by his understanding of God's law, that people should be free, and he also wrote that in addition to that, he felt intimately connected with this young man of his who had been ensnared. Taylor may have lived, most likely, in West Philadelphia as he attended the Jacksons' church there. But on hearing that the slave catchers were looking for him there, he fled across the river to Philadelphia proper to hide with his foster mother. He was discovered and likely was taken into custody by the marshal as bystanders formed a crowd to loudly protest. You can imagine the scene as word spread. The message immediately traveled back to West Philadelphia, and Reverend Jackson, who immediately went into action in hopes of capitalizing on the chaos accompanying the arrest. I suspect he and his group of men stormed the marshal's second floor office, which was located in Independence Hall. Think about it. Birthplace of democracy, right? In our country. Right next to it were some prison cells, and nearby, also on the same floor, was the district court, which is where the Fugitive Slave Court proceedings happened. They likely figured it would be easier, these would-be rescuers, to free Taylor there before he was taken to the more secure city jail. Wrested away, Taylor was dressed in women's clothing, successfully connected to the Underground Railway, and made it to Toronto dressed in women's clothing some days later. There was confirmation. It may have taken a few days, few hours, likely a few days, for Taylor to get to Canada, but it took much less time to arrest Reverend Jackson and the three men who also were with him and charged with kidnapping. Refusing to seek bail, he went to City Hall and stayed in not City Hall, but the jail. Through the efforts of three leading citizens, he was released on a writ of habeas corpus late in the night as family, parishioners, and community prayed at his house, the parsonage. Imagine the stress, the fear, the worry, the terror Jane and the wife, and the children faced. They had no idea of what was going to happen next. I don't know how much he considered this as he was propelled to action in the face of stark injustice. It wouldn't be the last time he would take such risks to free someone from the US Marshal and federal custody. The next time it happened, it would be during a trial. 4 months later, Reverend Jackson likely rushed from Philadelphia to Boston on hearing another Norfolk native, about 4 years younger, or older rather than he, Shadrach Minkins, had become the first self-liberated person to be arrested in Boston after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. Jackson proudly wrote about this years later, and it was reported in the newspaper 50 years later when he died. By the way, these actions too could have been charged as treasonous. He writes, regarding the Navy Yard as being more secure than the Boston jail during the trial, I had the honor of leading a brave party of men who, knowing the price of liberty, broke open the doors of the courthouse during the trial recess, took the marshal's sword from the stand, and rescued the prisoner. The crowd, amidst the shouts of the friends of freedom and the multitude along the line of the rescuing party, passed down Cambridge Street while the owners were scowling spectators of the scene from the windows on the second floor of the Revere House. We placed the fugitive on board the Underground Railroad where no slave could touch him. 6 days later, Minkins arrived in Toronto. The reason I wanted to leave this slide of Jane up while I talked about it was to make the point as visually as possible that the family of Underground Railroad conductors who were conductors and assistants themselves, including their kids, were very much involved in all of this, no matter where they were at the time that this was happening. Okay, back to the early days. Next slide, please. The Old Point Comfort Lighthouse. I finally got to see it in May. Here's what he writes. When quite a boy, my first voyage was made with my father on a sloop called the Markwell to Hampton, or Old Point Comfort. By the way, this lighthouse would have been there when he first took this voyage. This increased my desire for following the sea. I was afterwards placed under the care of a relative on a steamer, the Norfolk, plying between Norfolk and Baltimore. I then felt myself quite a mariner, for though I was but just a lad, I knew or understood every nook and corner of the bay, and I could point out every light from the Rip Raps near Hampton to Fort McHenry, Think Star Spangled Banner, near Baltimore. Next slide, please. The SS Columbus. The text says, and I'll reference it later, here I had charge of the bar, like, where people make drinks, until after the Southampton insurrection, which is the Nat Turner uprising. And the boat had to take a company of soldiers to Smithfield. That was the area that the Nat Turner insurrection happened, all the murders and rampaging. The Columbus, the steamboat. Children, including many Black Southern ones, went to work, or if they were lucky and were apprentices, early in the late 1820s, as there were no safety nets outside of whatever support you could find in your circle of family. Imagine, William left home around 9 or 10 to learn everything he could about working on the overnight steamboats, Pocahontas, Norfolk, and Columbus, that sailed between Norfolk, Baltimore, and Richmond, Virginia. Put under an older cousin's watchful eye, he was at home at most a night or two a week for years. Again, he was 9 or 10 years old when this started. In addition to the independence it would foster, it's hard to overstate the impact of the other formative, and I'd say brutal aspect of the James River route he covered over a certain number of years. It was the full display of slavery that was just outside the vessel's windows, on plantations along the way, and at the steamboat's terminus in Richmond. Not only was Richmond the capital of Virginia, it became the second largest market of enslaved people in the United States, second only to New Orleans. His hometown, Norfolk, similarly was a large market of enslaved people for those taken from Washington, D.C. and Maryland and sailed down to New Orleans. I've often wondered, why he was so driven in his anti-slavery work. And as I learn more about what he would have seen then, I think I have my answer. It was the vicious inhumanity up close that he witnessed as a young, free Black boy. Next slide, please. Bermuda 100. I took these next few slides when I just had to be on the river that William was and to try and get a sense of it all these years later. It's like nearly 200 years later. You'd never guess from this serene photo I took in May that this was a bustling hub of river traffic once in general, and people were selling enslaved folks. This port and Osborne's Landing, just up the river a piece, was heavily involved in the international trade of enslaved people in the 17th and 18th centuries in particular. They even had their own customs house. I made a special point to have my river guide take me here. Next slide, please. To make the point, this ad says, just arrived from Africa. It's from 1772, by the way. This ship, Prince of Wales, with about 400 fine, healthy slaves for sale. It's going to begin at Bermuda 100 until all are sold. Enslavement was real here. It was not an abstraction. Next, please. This is another serene place. And it was only about 5 minutes before I took this picture that I found out that James' stepbrother was in the 2nd U.S. Colored Troops Cavalry Regiment. And I happened to mention this to a Civil War expert in the boat who was on the trip with us. And he said, he paused for a minute and then he said, oh, well, less than 24 hours ago, it was the 157th anniversary of an action that took place in about 5 minutes. And I'll show you where they built a pontoon bridge and thousands of people crossed. That's it. Next slide, please. Rockets Landing. I spent one afternoon, night, and morning in Richmond. My heart couldn't take more. I normally would do something this intense alone, but a dear friend from high school was there with me as we staggered through what we saw on a sweltering day. This was the terminus of William's weekly steamboat trips to Richmond. Again, considered the second market, biggest market of enslaved people. Related river and foot traffic would have been significant in this area. William likely would have been safe only on his steamboat to prevent his kidnap and harassment. His early years were saturated with sights, sounds, and smells of enslavement, particularly in certain Norfolk and James River locations. The infamous Shockoe Bottom, just a bit down the river by those skyscrapers that you see, it was the site of the sales, hotels for the brokers and the sellers, the prisons for self-freed but then captured Black folks, and a graveyard for us too. The city's hangings happened here too. You can feel it. The energy of abject, accrued misery sticks to your clothes and your skin and it sinks in. For Jane, her encounters with enslavement would have been a more rural version, where in her home area, plantations and farms generally were smaller, and it wouldn't have been unusual to see owners and enslaved people working side by side in the fields. While Jane was born free, it's unlikely her parents, Annis and George, were. In fact, of the two most likely candidates of her mother, of being her mother, both were involved in freedom suits based on their legally acknowledged Indian heritage. Laborers, the family was impoverished with a few of the men forced into labor to pay taxes they couldn't afford. We don't know when Jane moved to Philadelphia, but she was there by late May of 1837 when she and William married. She would have arrived in time for racial and ethnic unrest and the race riots of 1838 and 42. While living in Norfolk with her family, William's mother, Keziah, received free papers from Caroline County, Virginia in 1825. Next slide, please. Her younger children needed theirs unexpectedly in the aftermath of the Nat Turner insurrection about 60 miles away. The massacre, I'll explain this slide in a minute, don't try and read it. The massacre and reprisal murders immediately worsened the tightening conditions for free Black people in addition to enslaved folks. And his parents decided they needed to move away from their home in slave country immediately. They headed to Philadelphia. When my colleague, Dr. Rilling, located the record you see here, I discovered there are 3 siblings we never knew about: Kitty, Millie Ann, Rohim. The white person who vouched for their free status in court was the same person who had sold property to their grandfather that would become their family home in 1802. And that had been 30 years earlier. This document is from the county record books, or excuse me, the city court hearings. Next slide, please. William had free papers too, and these are his that were issued in 1832 and signed by the mayor. One of the things that it says in there is having been born free, which acknowledged that indeed his mother had been liberated before he was born. Next slide, please. I'm going to do a time check. No way. 20 minutes. Okay. I have another story that I want to tell you. This is a picture of a war sloop. After William had gotten to Philadelphia, he entered into butlering. He was a butler. A few years after butler service in the homes of politically powerful people, you can only imagine what this must have been like. But in his writing, he talks about them as kind and as people who were concerned about his education. They gave him free access to their libraries, and it meant the world of difference to him. At 16, William finally got his wish, though, including parental permission to go to sea. The USS Vandalia left the Navy Yard back in Norfolk, bound for the Caribbean on various missions. When the officer he served left the ship for personal reasons, William writes of his terror that he would face reprisals from shipmates who strongly resented the respect with which his white lieutenant had treated him. He transferred to the USS Grampus to chase pirates and illegal ships carrying Africans to sell. Conditions were smooth enough under his new officer, but the seas were anything but. His description of one particular storm is hair-raising. While things could and did happen at sea in the days when ships could operate autonomously for weeks on end, the last story I want to tell you about from this young mariner involved the aftermath of the shipboard death of a naval commodore. And this is from William. We had a long and very dangerous passage, but through the blessings of God, we arrived safe in Pensacola. Commodore Handley died on board our vessel, and sometime afterwards, we were in Havana with the body. We then thought we would be ordered home, but to our disappointment, we were ordered back to the station. A word to anti-temperance friends. In that country, we had no way of preserving the body until we could reach Pensacola, but by putting the body in a leaden coffin and immersing it in whiskey, and then a thick box to preserve it. Notwithstanding all of this and the love of alcohol of some of our crew, they succeeded in boring holes through both box and coffin and getting to the whiskey. From that day to this, I can bear neither the taste nor smell of whiskey. A good reason too. He was likely relieved to return to butlering and ministry preparation for the next 7 years. His mariner years were fully behind him. Next slide. So I'm going to go through these and give you the visual taste of their family and the things that touched them. So this is Jane, William, the youngest surviving daughter, Mary Alice, who's also called Nan, and Edgar. Edgar is my great-grandfather. The Jacksons, as I mentioned, were born in 1837, and this picture was taken sometime probably between 1864 and 1866. Next slide, please. This is the actual copy of Reverend Jackson's Baptor's minister's license, and it's one of the items that is in the exhibit. I can't tell you what it meant to lay eyes on this not that long ago, knowing that it had been lovingly tended for so long before it emerged from down cellar. His Baptist minister practice, avocation, career saturated the rest of his life, and this means everything. Next picture, please. This is his church in West Philadelphia. This image, I think, is one of my very favorite churches ever. He dedicated this church in 1848. And this is taken much later, closer to the turn of the century. And in trying to identify and get permission to display another image of the church, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania found this about 5 days ago. The image of the little girl walking across just really gets me. There was so much that happened here. Next. So is Reverend Jackson walked raising money on the Underground Railroad, and you name it. There were times when it was pretty tough, and his journal is full of talk about the weather, but also things such as what you see here. He was walking in snow and cold. He would get depressed. And this line from the Bible, "Oh, for the wings of a dove, then would I fly away and be at rest," in 1857, really particularly speaks to me. Next, please. Similarly, he was tired. And on this page, he talks about cholera. In this case, he calls it cholery, has been raging in their quiet village of West Philadelphia, and that there were no ministers who could step in to their community to take over in case he took it easy. Next slide, please. Dear husband, the collection is full of letters from Jane, and it's because he was on the road and that she stayed in Philadelphia much of the time that he took assignments other places or was doing his work, that we actually know what was going on for the family and the children, with some pretty searing accounts of a child being born when he wasn't there, and could he please hurry up and come home? He didn't make it, meaning William didn't make it. The child was born. Children died clustered close together, and he was present for most of those. There was one sad case, though, where one of their sick children passed away just after he had gotten to New Bedford, and their telegrams from Jane, including the one saying that their daughter had passed, and if he couldn't make it home because he was too busy with work, could he tell her what undertaker to use? So he sent back an undertaker and told her, do what you need to do, and here's the undertaker's name. We later learned that he had smallpox, and that was the reason that he couldn't travel. There were triumphs, but life was tough, and they just kept going. Next slide, please. You can imagine this is a letter she wrote as the really sad things involving their children were happening. And she finally acknowledges that she's really tired, but otherwise things are okay. Next, please. This is the image. This also is in the exhibit that's regarded as a coded message from the Underground Railroad station, hints about where to go pick someone up. And it's from him to her, and he was living in Philadelphia at the time, as was she. So not quite sure why there was a letter, but it says, to William Jackson, B. Jones sends his love and says, look well to the south is well. And it's from 1843. The fact that the word well shows up a couple of times makes me think that maybe there were two people to pick up. Next, please. Back to the earlier comments that I was making about the story when Reverend Jackson rescued the young man who is the parishioner, and got him to, or the young man got to Toronto via the Underground Railroad. Here's the letter confirming that. Signed, yours in God and liberty. And that too is in the exhibit. Next, please. He has accounts in his journals where he notes here, for example, that he helped 2 other men get to freedom. They weren't the only ones, but I'm including it here. Next. Reverend Jackson fought hard, in his words, about the importance of Black men being able to fight to earn their rights. And as you know, they finally were given permission, and he became the chaplain of the 55th Massachusetts Regiment. This is his GAR, or veteran's hat, from after the war that actually lived in my closet for 30 or 40 years. It's very special, and it's in the exhibit. There's clearly not time to talk about the vast array of experiences he had. At the time, he was thought to be the first Black officer in the Union Army when he was mustered in July of 1863. Turns out there were some Black officers down in Louisiana who had been brought into the Union Army in 1862 by General Butler when they were swamped and needed folks to help out, soldiers to help out. He went down to the front. It was tough. He was really sick. There was racism, crocodiles or alligators. I can't remember which ones we have in the United States. Alligators, snapping turtles. He had the smallest tent of all the officers. He finally resigned and got an honorable discharge in January on the 14th, 1864. Next slide, please. He went back to Massachusetts, but by 1870, he moved on to Providence, Rhode Island. This is a church he's strongly associated with. That round circle in the top is probably where the clock went, that he claimed was the first clock in a Black church in the United States. He moved on from there before he retired. Next slide, please. Here he is, Oak Bluffs, Massachusetts. It's a faded picture. The oak tree is small. The cottage is still standing on Central Avenue, and the oak tree is big and mighty. You can see he's holding his bell. And I thought it important as we wrap up our talks to just show where he was. He and Jane actually boarded people, and Frederick Douglass was one of the guests in this cottage. It's I'm trying to imagine how folks fit in small spaces, but they did back then. And they would winter. He bought this in 1871, rented it the year before, and it stayed in the family for 50 years and was home. It was home. Next, please. I also included another couple of slides from the end of his life. By now, Jane had already passed away. They had hoped to spend their last years together at not the Cape, at the vineyard. And she passed away walking to church in a snowbank in 1888. And so his last years were at the Cape by himself. He would usually be there about 6 months a year, and as the town crier for much of that until he was pretty old. In this picture, I believe he's standing in his veterans, his GAR uniform coat. And I think he's holding the hat that you would see if you went to the exhibit. Maybe a little tired, head tilted to the left. Next picture, please. Here's another one that I just love. Over his shoulder, you'll see horses in the background. You'll see women in fancy dress. He has a floppy hat. I don't think this was his, dressed up town crier outfit, but just, at ease. And I don't think this is too far from where he was. Next. So who were they ultimately? They were devoted people of God, committed to social justice, community, and family. Last slide, please. Here I am saying thank you to Martha's Vineyard Museum. This, by the way, is my membership card, and I hope you think about joining the historical societies and museums where you have family. But this is me at my first birthday, and I'm inside the house that William and Jane built in 1858. And from here in Portland, Oregon, through New Bedford, Massachusetts, and Smith Street, where that house is, to the Cape, Martha's Vineyard, and wherever else you may be. Thank you so much for being with me. I can't wait to connect with you sometime. Thank you. Bonnie, I think I've only left a couple of minutes for questions. Sorry.
Well, I think that if anybody has any, they can just pop them into the chat or the Q&A. But I thank you, Valerie. That was such an interesting talk, and you added so much more detail. There are a few things that are in the exhibit that you didn't talk about. You talked about a lot about things that are not in the exhibit. So we really, really appreciate your joining us for this talk. And we have one question. Valerie, what an incredible story. Can you tell us when the book will be coming out?
Excuse me. My dad would say my ethnicity just came out. My hope is that you see it in the next year. And if my publisher looks at this, he's going to have the same question. So yeah, I'm hoping. I've got 90% of the first draft done, and have spent the last several months filling in the footnotes and trying to document just what the facts were surrounding what my ancestors were writing about. And so far, everything's been legit. I actually speak next month, a month from yesterday, at a conference of early American historians out of UPenn, the McNeil Center, and I'll be talking about Jane. So that's something else that I'll be doing before I get back to my writing or in between writing. Thanks so much for the question.
Next question. What's your best guess for the date range that Reverend Jackson was the Oak Bluffs town crier?
So I'm going to let you answer this because you're the one who found the answer.
So the earliest, so there's an 1891 article that references that he's been the town crier for about, I think 7 years or so. So we're thinking maybe 1883. And then I don't know when it ended, probably around 95 or a little earlier than that, but I'm not sure. He wasn't in good health. You had mentioned that he was looking for a pension because of his ill health. So I think that he did do that for, maybe 10 years or so.
Yeah, I think, and I think it's either Andrew Patch or Skip Finley. Hello. Local folks, very important to the history and life of your community in Oak Bluffs, who actually sent me a page from, I think it's the 1897 directory from Oak Bluffs, or it was called Cottage City then, showing that he was known as the town crier. But you're right, I don't think he would have been very active at the time. And it's interesting because if it's that early, he would have been doing it during summer breaks from his ministry work before he retired.
Another question, what year did Frederick Douglass visit Reverend Jackson in the Campground Cottage? Something makes me want to say 76. Does that sound right to you?
I was going to answer it by saying it was in the 1870s. Again, Andrew found the reference, I believe, and I want to say 73, but I'm not. If I looked quickly enough on my phone, I'd be able to tell you in a heartbeat. But it was definitely in the 70s. They were friends. Their ninth child was actually named after him, and he and his wife came to their 50th wedding anniversary and gave them gold sleeve buttons. But they didn't overlap in New Bedford, but they had a lot in common.
Let's see. Somebody's asking if the Oak Bluffs house has a historical marker. Not yet.
Keep hope alive.
Really?
I'm so sorry that I'm not there. And I, on behalf of not just the Jacksons and the importance to them or family and the New Bedford friends and family who love them. But I think for African Americans in general, it's important to know that there were in fact Black folks who had homes. And without saying too much or taking anybody's thunder away about articles that will soon be appearing, I would just say, anybody who can help make this happen is welcome to join in.
The next question kind of goes along with some of that. Do you have any idea what drew the Jacksons to Martha's Vineyard in the first place?
I do. When Reverend Jackson left Philadelphia in 1851 to take the 1-year assignment at Second Baptist Church in New Bedford, he says that he sailed through Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, where they made friends, lifelong friends. And so he must have seen it. He saw it in 1851 and remembered it and liked it. We don't know whether he managed to make it out while he was there that 1 year in New Bedford, but it wouldn't surprise me because he would have been drawn to the religious community there. And the Black Baptists were active out there. All we have in terms of documentation is the rental from 1870.
Okay, and I think one last question. It's sort of a personal question, I think. Do you know of Edwin B. Jourdain from New Bedford?
Well, in our family, Jourdain is pronounced the Jourdains.
Okay.
And they were longtime family friends for generations. So yes.
Well, that's wonderful. And I thank you once again for your wonderful talk and all of your great research. We will be looking for your book when it comes out. And I hope that at some point you will be able to make the trip to Martha's Vineyard yourself. And once again, thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this talk. We love having you here. Please come to the exhibit. It just adds more to see the actual things. It's kind of an emotional experience. So
I have one more thing to add, one more quick thing.
Sure.
And it's that when I do presentations like this, I always feel it's important to say, find somebody to tell your story to, or who looks like they might be interested in hearing your story. But more importantly, to hear what their story is. There's so much that we can learn in community about sharing who we are, who knows what, before memories fade, documents get put out on a curb because they look like junk. I think that our humanity is grounded in our stories, our past. We have our dreams for the future, but this is so important. So talk to each other. I have a poet friend who is the poet laureate of Oregon, whose father told him, talk to strangers. Otherwise, how are you going to learn anything? Bye for now.
Wonderful. Thank you. Bye, everyone.